And for us at Women and Children First, we occupy the land of the Peoria, the Potawatomi, Miami, and Sioux people. If you would like to be able to acknowledge the land in which you are on that does not belong to you, or know more about land acknowledgement, you can access it at native-land.ca. And because we at Women and Children First are all about sharing resources, we will actually have that link included in the chat box. In addition to that link, you will be able to access the link to purchase the ever thought-provoking book of tonight, Prison by Any Other Name, as well as any other titles that may be mentioned tonight. Because we are, because we are aware that scholarship inspires one another, if at any point any of the panelists mention any other titles, we're going to be working really, really, really hard to get the links to those books in the chat as well. If you are in the Chicago area and you can come visit us in our store Monday through Sunday, 11 a.m. to 6 p.m. to purchase books, to continue the conversation started here tonight, or just to say hi. If you are social distancing, please know that you can place an online order at womenandchildrenfirst.com, and we will gladly ship to you. If you want to continue this virtual life with us, you can visit our website as well to see what other events are planned, because all of our events for the rest of the year will be virtual. Now let's get to the juicy, which is Prison by Any Other Name, which I believe is vast in its ambitions. As Michelle Alexander stated in the foreword, is that it is aiming to introduce a new cast of characters into view, from teachers and pastors who work with police in order to create gang databases, to school counselors, psychiatrists, and scientists, and oh my, right, like in a list of other players. It's also aiming to break down harmful common sayings such as, we just need more mental health institutions instead of prisons. This book came ready to play, to shock, and to empower. Now, a little bit about the people who will be talking to you tonight. Our interpreters will be Deana Hart and Rodney Laban, who will be switching out every 15 minutes because signing is work, y'all, and everybody deserves breaks. If we are fighting against capitalism, we have to start to practice that. So they will be switching out every 15 minutes. We will have a captioner by the name of Janet Hamilton, who you will see doing some of that caption work and who you've probably already started to see. On our panel is Victoria Law, who is a freelance journalist and author focusing on the interactions of incarceration, gender, and resistance. She's the author of Residents Behind Bars, The Struggles of Incarcerated Women, and the co-author of Prison by Any Other Name, The Harmful Consequences of Popular Reform. She lives in New York City with her daughter. Then there's Maya Schenwar, the editor-in-chief of Turnout. She is the author of Locked Down, Locked Out, Why Prison Doesn't Work and How We Can Do Better, and co-author of Prison by Any Other Name. She's also the co-editor of Who Do You Serve, Who Do You Protect? Police Violence and Resistance in the United States. Maya lives in Chicago with her toddler. Then there's Deana Lewis, who is a member of Love and Protect, a collective dedicated to BIPOC women or BIPOC women, trans and GNC folks who are criminalized or harmed by state and interpersonal violence, and a co-founder of the Just Practice Collaborative. Her scholarly and activism work focuses on trans and non-trans Black women and girls who have experienced state violence. There's Beth Richie, who is the head of the Department of Criminology, Law, and Justice, and professor of Black Studies and Gender and Women's Studies at UIC. A longtime activist in the movements against gender violence, Richie's work focuses on challenging mass criminalization of Black women and genderqueer people from an abolitionist feminist perspective. And lastly, there's Monica Jones, who will be joining us soon, who is a Black transgender advocate who also advocates for the right of sex workers and low-income women of color. She is the founder of the Outlaw Project, an organization based on the principles of intersectionality to prioritize the leadership of people of color, transgender women, gender non-binary, and migrants for sex worker rights. Ms. Jones has been an advocate for rights for more than a decade and has experienced police reprisals as a direct result of her activism. In 2013, after speaking at a public action protesting rights, violating arrest under the Project ROSE, ROSE, diversion program in Phoenix, Arizona. She was arrested. In partnership with local and national organizations, including the ACLU, AZ, and Arizona Prison Watch, Monica Jones created a campaign that garnered local, national, and global attention about the injustice of statutes that facilitated arresting her for walking while trans. This successful 2-year campaign opened the way for discussion in the media about how the laws used to criminalize trans people and the diversion offered by Project ROSE that has in fact stripped them of due process and their rights and rooted people into overcrowded jails. Her case is now frequently cited in legal and policy briefs in support of strategic litigation campaigns. So that's a little bit about our panel. And without further ado, I will turn things over to Maya.
Hi, I'm just gonna say a quick thank you. I'm so glad that we get to be here doing this event at Women and Children First, even though we're not in the physical bookstore. So thank you, Raven. I've been coming to this bookstore as far back as I can remember. One of my earliest memories in life takes place in the children's section of this store, sitting on the floor with my mom. So I'm really honored that we're here virtually. I'm sad we can't all be hanging out in person, but there are advantages to the Zoom experience, including the fact that people who might not otherwise be able to join us at the physical bookstore are joining us tonight. So thank you to everyone who is here. We really appreciate you coming. Before we get started, I just want to urge everyone to please buy books from Women and Children First. You can order our book, obviously, through the link in the chat. But you can also buy any book from Women and Children First, and you'll be supporting such an important space for social justice and feminist community at obviously a tough time. I also want to just take a moment and thank our co-sponsors, Love and Protect, the Chicago Community Bond Fund, and Chicago Books to Women in Prison. Thank you so much for supporting this event. These are fantastic abolitionist organizations in Chicago. Full disclosure, I'm part of some of them myself. But seriously, everyone should check out their work. And I think we'll probably talk more about Love and Protect a little bit, in particular later tonight. I'm so grateful to our incredible moderator, Deana, and our other incredible panelists, Beth and Monica, for being here with me and Vicky tonight and talking about issues around this book. We're honored. And I also want to thank Rodney and Dion and Janet, our interpreters and captioner. We're so thankful to you for helping make this event accessible. And just a note for everyone who's watching and listening, we're going to have a Q&A, so ask us questions. You can do that through the Q&A box on Zoom, and also through YouTube live chat if you're watching this via YouTube. So let's get started. I'm going to turn things over to Vicky to tell you a little bit about our book.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here. It is great to be hosted by Women and Children First. Again, I echo Maya that I'm sad that we can't all be together in the same place. So one of the things that we look at in our book, Prison by Any Other Name, looks at what incarceration and criminalization look like without the physical structures of jails and prisons. How do some of the most popular alternatives to incarceration actually replicate incarceration in our homes, on our streets, in our communities? How do they function with the same logic of replacement, of putting people somewhere else? And how do they continue to perpetuate racism, colonialism, genocide, patriarchy, misogyny, and homophobia and transphobia in the same ways in which prison does? And at the same time, how do some of the institutions that are supposed to be helpful, such as schools and social work agencies, see the creep of criminalization hindering and criminalizing people and pulling more people into a net of punishment under the guise of treatment. So our book looks at many popularly proposed alternatives to incarceration, such as electronic monitoring as an alternative for locking people in physical jails and prisons, diversion programs, whether it is drug diversion programs through drug courts or drug treatment, sex work diversion programs for people who are picked up and arrested for sex work, and then also institutions such as the child welfare system and the foster care agencies, in which people are made to jump through hoops and perform the same logic as the prison system does to people, primarily Black and brown people. And then with some of these institutions, particularly Black, brown, and low income mothers who are being penalized because they don't have resources, not because this somehow benefits people's safety and security. So that is our brief synopsis of the book. We're thrilled to be joined by Monica Jones, whom we interviewed for our book and who so generously shared not only her experiences of being targeted by one of these so-called alternatives to incarceration, but also her work fighting against these types of carceral creep into our streets, in our homes, in our communities. And Beth Richie, whose work influenced us tremendously in the writing of our book as well. So thank you.
Great. Thanks, everyone. It's an honor to be here, to be the moderator, and I'm so humbled. And I want to give some hopefully brief comments to kind of set the stage for everyone. So as all of you know and are experiencing, we are living in a time that is tumultuous, chaotic, threatening. It's really scary and anxiety inducing. I want to recognize that. And in all of this, we are seeing people rising up again and again to continue to fight against state and state-sanctioned violence that we are seeing in housing, healthcare, of course, the legal system, and many other places. And it's at this time that I think of what our dear friend and comrade, or at least dear friend to many of us and comrade to many of us, many more, a radical abolitionist, Miriam Kaba, has said, "Let this radicalize you rather than lead you to despair." Right? Let this radicalize you rather than lead you to despair. And so I want you to think about this quote as we go through tonight's program. And I want us to challenge ourselves to think more deeply about the way we understand the world, and specifically the criminal legal system. So a few years ago, many people began talking about mass incarceration in Michelle Alexander's book, and Michelle Alexander wrote the foreword to Maya and Vicky's book. So Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, really helped to put a spotlight on the United States' horrendous trend of locking people up, disproportionately Black people. People formed book clubs. There were talks. Mainstream news picked up mass incarceration. Think pieces were written, blogs, so much information about mass incarceration. And this was an exciting time because so many people really awakened or became aware of this problem and how racism and capitalism helped to not only help, but supported the legal system, right? And really shaped it. In Prison by Another Name, Vicky and Maya agree with this and say yes and. So yes, mass incarceration, which is structured by racism and capitalism, are all major problems, they say. And so are the alternatives and reforms that have come from trying to fix the problem of mass incarceration. So as they say, let's look at solutions that abolitionists provide for us, specifically abolition with a feminist lens or a feminist understanding, meaning let's also address sexism, misogyny, and transphobia. I'm not sure a lot of folks listened, but now we are in a time when more and more people are talking about abolition, prison abolition, and police abolition. Schools are kicking police out of their hallways, universities are ending contracts with police on campus, Cities are defunding police departments. People are demanding that incarcerated folks are released from prisons and jails, especially under the death sentence that COVID-19 has created, I would say with the help of the state, and knowing that COVID-19 spreads through jails and prisons quickly and deadly. This time is really exciting. And as more and more people are saying abolition, or learning about abolition, or learning more about abolition, and really digging in and understanding what abolition means, we have more and more opportunities to address sexism, misogyny, transphobia, and of course, racism. We can also address race. We also need to address, I should say, racism and capitalism that undergird not only the entire legal system, right, including prisons, jails, and alternatives to both, but the US as a whole. And the folks that Vicky and Maya have talked to and written about and interviewed really show us how and show us examples that are tangible that we can take with us. And that is why we are here today. So let's get into it. So I have some questions for our amazing speakers, and I'm going to start with Maya. Also, I want to, as Maya said, encourage people to use the chat or the whatever feature that's available for you on Zoom or in YouTube to send us questions that I will collate, and we'll have time at the end for a Q&A. So Maya, the first question, like I said, is for you. What are some of the ways that popular prison and policing reforms impact women and trans and non-binary people in particular ways? For instance, how do probation and electronic monitoring impact women, trans, and gender non-conforming, agender, non-binary folks? And also, while you're answering that, if you can also just talk a little bit more about the gendered aspects of psychiatric and drug treatment.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Deana. So the majority of the population of prisons and jails is men, as most people know. And of course, we can't forget that there are also about 230,000 women in prison and jail, and women have been the fastest growing incarcerated group. But I also want to point out that among the so-called alternatives to prison, so a lot of these reforms that Vicky and I discuss in our book, like probation, the percentages of women are higher. Women are more likely to be convicted of low-level offenses like drug offenses and property offenses. So they're seen as great candidates for so-called alternatives to incarceration. Just a note, by the way, that when I mention women or men in the context of statistics and data, we have to keep in mind that this is the state, and courts are overwhelmingly not acknowledging non-binary people, and very often they're not recognizing people's real genders. They're misgendering trans people in particular. So I'll mention some data around gender, but I also want to acknowledge that the state should not be the agent of gender determination. So in terms of the so-called prison alternatives that have been offered as reforms, I'll talk about probation for a minute since it's the largest alternative to incarceration. And there are over 3.5 million people on probation in this country, and 25% of them are women. And we can compare that to 10% of the country's incarcerated population being women. And the probation population is disproportionately Black women, just as Black women are disproportionately incarcerated, because the system of probation isn't some sort of transformative solution. It's presented as an alternative, but it's still built on the same foundations of white supremacy and anti-Blackness that prison is built on. The population of women who are on so-called community supervision, so that includes probation and also parole, has almost doubled in the past 3 decades. And I think we have to recognize that many women face barriers that put them at increased danger of violating probation, which often means being sent back to jail or prison, in part because probation includes a lot of restrictions that interfere with the caregiving responsibilities that most women who are caught in the court system have, whether that's caring for young children, caring for an elderly relative. So some of the restrictions you've got on probation include curfews, appointments for very frequent drug testing, reporting in person to a probation officer, attending court mandated classes, and all of these mandates require time and scheduling around. And most women who are caught in the system are parents of minor children. So how do you coordinate childcare responsibilities around all of these very strict, harsh conditions? And keep in mind that missing those classes or court dates or drug tests or reporting sessions can have dire consequences. There's a report from the Harvard Kennedy School that we cite in our book that notes that probation is the largest alternative to incarceration, but it's also one of the biggest drivers of incarceration because so many people who violate probation are just sent back to jail or prison. Now, so if you don't attend a parenting class because you were busy actually parenting your child, you could be incarcerated. And we see similar issues with electronic monitoring, which you also asked about, Deana. Yeah, it's an increasingly common alternative to incarceration. And when you're on electronic monitoring, you're not allowed to leave the house without pre-approved permission. And often the penalty for doing so is, again, incarceration. So women are more likely to be primary caregivers for their children. And think about being a single mother living with your kids in a one-bedroom apartment on electronic monitoring. How do you please stay in that apartment 24/7, except for these pre-approved permissions? How do you get groceries? How do you attend emergency doctor's appointments for your kids? How do you go to the emergency room without risking incarceration? And so these are issues that people are facing not only in very particular circumstances, but on a really, really large scale. I want to mention also that electronic monitoring can present particular problems for trans and non-binary people seeking medical care. So one person that we interviewed who was on monitoring is a trans man, and he discussed how while he was on monitoring, he was told that if he wanted to visit the doctor, he would have to submit a request ahead of time. And then the doctor would be contacted by jail staff and informed that this man was on home confinement. And then the doctor would actually have to participate in policing. The doctor would be responsible for contacting the jail to say that this man had attended the appointment. So medical professionals are recruited into policing. And this person spoke about how, as a trans man, it was already so hard to find supportive medical providers and build a good relationship. And that relationship.
Maya, I think you're frozen a little bit, or a lot, actually. You're definitely frozen. Okay, so why don't we let Maya stay a little bit frozen and come back to her, and I'm gonna move on to Vicky. Because Vicky, I asked, or we had a question that's very similar for Vicky, and with just slightly different examples.
Oh, sorry. Oh. I don't know when I disappeared.
Okay.
Sorry, I was gonna say something about treatment, but
Go for it. Yep, let's do
yeah,
it.
I'll just really quickly say, I was gonna mention with court mandated drug treatment in psychiatric hospitals, those institutions, when people are not choosing to be there, are coercive. So in drug treatment, for example, not only are people not allowed to consume alcohol or other substances, often on penalty of going to prison, but they often can't even decide when to take a shower or when to eat. One person Vicky interviewed said she was even deprived of the decision of when to go to the bathroom at times. And physical and sexual violence are often prevalent at inpatient facilities, including just institutional practices like strip searches. And this can all be very, very traumatizing for survivors of gender-based violence because they're put in these positions where they have very little power and very little bodily autonomy. And I'm thinking about this webinar that you did recently, Beth, with Monica Cosby and Rachel Kydor, which was called Prison is Abuse. And it was very powerful and helpful, and talked about how prisons are in themselves coercive and function as abuse. And in many ways, I think we can see mandatory prison alternatives also functioning as coercion and as abuse.
Thanks, Maya. So Vicky, now let's turn to you. And again, still similar question with different examples. So again, what are some of the ways that prison and policing reforms impact women and trans and non-binary folks in particular ways, specifically around like prison nurseries and mother-baby prisons?
So these are two popularly proposed alternatives to incarceration. Well, one of them is a form of is a straight up form of incarceration, and the other is an alternative to incarceration that are particularly gendered, and they're particularly cisgendered as well, because I don't know of any trans parents who have gotten into these programs as out trans people. So they're particularly gendered because they're directed towards women and mothers. They're particularly cisgendered because they do not, as far as I know, accept trans women or trans parents into these programs. So there are two types of sort of like prison nurseries or family prisons, or what you want to call it, that we examine in our book. The first of which is prison nurseries, which when people talk about the fact that the majority of women in prison are mothers to young children, a lot of times the first response of liberals and progressive reformers or people who don't know a lot about prisons is, oh, what if we just had prison nurseries? So then they could have their children with them in the prison. Keep in mind that the majority of people in men's prisons are also parents to minor children, and nobody talks about putting prison nurseries into men's prisons, because we have a way in society in which we gender parenting. So, mothers are assumed to be the primary caregivers, expected to be the primary caregivers, criminalized and penalized when they do not live up to these expectations as perfectly as expected of them. Whereas men who perform even basic things like taking care of their own children expect to get a cookie every time they are on daddy duty. So this is, the way that we gender parenting in society. And we see this in the way that these carceral institutions work as well. So 7 states currently have prison nurseries in which a cisgender woman who is sentenced to prison or goes to Rikers Island, the jail in New York City, enters pregnant or has a very, very young child, as in like under the age of 1, can apply to be in this nursery program so that the baby can be with her in the prison. She and the baby are still subjected to all of the same rules and regulations of the prison. You have to stand up for count. You got to go to your prison work assignment. You got to go to your prison programs. You cannot, just go wander around the place. You have to do all of these things. And if not, you will be punished. And the punishment also entails your baby will be taken away from you. Only in New York State are you allowed to keep to apply for and be eligible for the prison nursery program if your conviction involves what is known as a violent crime. And as people who know anything about the way the legal system works, is violence is a construct. It is not necessarily you have actually done physical harm to somebody else. Like burglary can be considered a violent crime. Being in the same room as somebody who committed an armed robbery is considered a violent crime. So there are all these ways in which people can be nixed out of programs in 6 states. So that right away is a barrier for many people seeking to keep their children with them, even if it is not ideal, even if it doesn't mean, even if it means that they're parenting behind cages and with prison restrictions. But again, this is broached as an alternative. And I think one telling thing about these prison nurseries is that at the start of the pandemic in March and April, New York has a prison nursery, Illinois has a prison nursery. And at the start of the pandemic, every woman in the prison nursery and her baby was sent home. So these are all people who the state declares are not actually quote unquote threats to the safety and security of society. These are women and children who may as well have just gone home at the very beginning, because the hoops that you have to jump through to be able to get into the prison nursery program is you have to prove that you are not a threat to anybody's safety. Well, if you're not a threat to anybody's safety, then there is really no point in locking you and your child up. But again, because we're dealing with a system that is addicted to punishment and a society that would rather punish than provide support, the idea is the support is you get to keep your baby with you and you're responsible for your baby's safety and security while inside a very unsafe and unsecure place like prison, where you have very little control over what you are and are not allowed to do. Another alternative that we look at that is seen as an alternative to incarceration are mother-baby outpatient programs, in which we call mother-baby prisons in our book, but they're actually technically alternatives to incarceration. And these are locked down facilities, so very similar to prisons, in which you are locked down, you are told when to get up, when you can go out, you have to go to programs, but you are allowed passes to go out. It's a little bit like maybe being in a work release program or a halfway house. And you are allowed to keep your child with you. Again, you have to usually be pregnant or have a small child. If you have a 15-year-old, too bad, so sad. Your 15-year-olds cannot come live with you in one of these alternatives to incarceration. There may or may not be limits to how many children you can bring with you. So if you have 5 children under the age of 6, you may not be able to bring all 5 children. You might have to figure out which of your children need to go to other family members. And there are 11 states and the federal government that have embraced these mother-baby alternatives to prison or prison light programs. And again, they're geared towards people who identify as mothers. They're geared towards cisgender women who identify as mothers. And their children can only be up to a certain age. Like many of the nursery programs, you are only allowed to be in these programs if you meet certain criteria, such as you are convicted of a nonviolent crime. Oftentimes, you either are not allowed to have had a child welfare case, or you're there under the threat of having your children being taken away by child welfare for violating any of these rules. They're characterized by confinement and control. So mothers are subject to pat-down searches. They're subject to strict rules. And these rules extend to their children, like what they're allowed to feed their children as snacks, or what TV shows they're allowed to watch. So it is a very strict monitoring of everything you can do. And there's always a threat, not only of being sent back to prison, the way you are with electronic monitoring and probation and drug courts, but also the threat of having your children be sent to foster care if you violate these rules. So this is a really good way of trying to keep people under control, because you are not only threatening to deprive them of their liberty, you're threatening to deprive them of their right to family and children. And again, these are very gendered ways and cisgendered ways that we're seeing the creep of criminalization come into these programs that are supposed to somehow be helpful for families, particularly mothers and small children, which actually instead just subject them to more control and more punishment.
Thanks, Maya and Vicky. And let me just also put a quick note in that I'm sure many of you already understand and are good with, but because being a part of these video conference presentations for many months or even years for some people, we appreciate your patience with any type of tech glitches, because even though it's 2020, we don't have universal, free, and really good, strong internet, which is asinine. Anyway. So for our next speaker, I have a question. Before I do, I just want to point out that in my cleaning phase of this quarantine, I found this button. I hope you can see it. Can you see it? Because it's gorgeous. Look at that button. So it's a button, I think it's art made by Micah Bazant or Bazant. I'm not sure how to say their last name. Of our next speaker, Monica Jones, who is amazing. It's just interesting that you kind of passed through my mind a couple weeks ago, and I didn't realize we'd be on this panel together. But my question for you, and to lead up to it, Monica, is another way to surveil and ultimately place people into the carceral system are different savior projects that are presented as alternatives to prisons or jails. For instance, sex worker rescue programs are one alternative to prison that many people don't know about. So can you tell us about these sex worker rescue programs? What are they? How do they operate? And also, can you speak about how these programs really criminalize trans women in particular?
Yes, thank you so much for the opportunity to be on this panel. So when we talk about the savior programs for anti-prostitution, what we are dealing with are like faith-based programs. Like Catholic Charities is a big organization that does these diversion programs, and many of the times you are introduced to these programs through the court system. So like many times it's like your first arrest. They offer these programs, and these programs are not like any type of program. They are like month-long programs, like and sometimes, especially in Phoenix, Arizona, the Catholic Charities, they are about like you can be in that program for a year because you have to complete a week-long class, which is it starts at 8 o'clock in the morning and to 4 o'clock in the morning. And so if you're someone with a 9-to-5 job or you're a full-time college student, finding a way to take out a class to do a week-long class is very hard. And so many times individuals are in these programs until they have a vacation day they can take off, or until like summer vacation. And so and what these programs, they don't offer childcare. They don't they give you a bus card to take the bus. And so if you're coming from across town, you might have to take a 2-hour bus to get there at 8 o'clock in the morning. So that means you got to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning to get ready, then to be down there at 8 o'clock. And if you're late one day, you have to start the whole program over. And so, and if you don't finish the program, they report you back to the court system. You go to court, and then you do your time, your original time. And if you get called again, you might can do it again. And so these programs are really about money, and it's making money off of Black and brown bodies, right? And it is no different from slavery and everything else. And so when it comes to like trans people and engaging in sex work and everything else, it's these big laws, these little laws that lead up to your introduction to the prison system, right? And these are like laws that are like the manifestation law, which is just the basic laws that's saying if you are walking down the street in a known prostitute area, you can be arrested under the manifestation law. And under this ordinance, you can be the way you're dressed, hailing for a taxi, walking, having a car stop, having a car honk at you, drawing any attention to yourself as an individual, especially as a Black woman or especially as a trans person, makes you eligible to be arrested under these manifestation laws. Like in New York, they have the loitering with the intent. And so these laws are your first introduction, and especially in Phoenix, they treat these violation of these ordinance as the same thing as you're doing being convicted for the actual crime. And so in Arizona, we have a minimum of 15 days in prison or jail for your first offense. It goes up to 3 months, 6 months, then a year in prison. And you can, if depending on your judge, they can stack them on. So you can be doing, after that, you might do 2 years, 3 years. And so it depends on the judge. And the way these things impact trans women is, especially Black trans women, we know that the average income of a Black trans woman is less than $10,000. And in these areas, these are low income areas that they have these ordinances, city ordinance in. So the manifestation law in Phoenix, Arizona only applies to areas of low income. But if you go a mile up the street in Scottsdale, that ordinance does not apply. And so they're policing Black and brown bodies, especially when it comes to trans women. Our bodies are already policed. And sometimes we're not just policed by the police, but we're policed by the state. We're policed by members of our own community. And so this whole process of policing our bodies. But then when we get into this whole thing of the prison system, our bodies are already policed there too, right? And so having to do time in man's prison, and we know prison is not a safe place for anyone, right? But then we also have this concept of like defund the police, but we're really not having these conversations on like what does that really look like, right? And if you really want to defund the police, then we must abolish these ordinances and laws that pit people in direct contact with the police. So if you are ready for defunding the police, then you must decriminalize sex work. You must decriminalize marijuana. You must decriminalize drug use and everything else that put people at risk and the direct interaction with the police. And so with these manifestation laws in Phoenix, they are the main source of the way trans people and women of color are put into the prison system, right? Because just like my case, like when I started, I'm innocent, I'm not doing this stuff. And like, why are you arresting me? We saw that the whole court system was set up for someone to plead guilty during my experience, right? And going in, you have to talk to the prosecutor, right? To see if they really want to pursue your case. And then if they want to pursue your case, you have to go up to get a public defender. And so it's this whole process of like, sometimes many people won't fight back, right? But in my case, everybody says you're brave for fighting back, but in my case, I did not have a choice but to fight back, right? Because the only outcome of that was jail time. And so as a Black trans woman, I will not give up my time, right? My time as a Black trans woman is very important to me. And so I saw that this court system was not set up for us. But then like, when you're in Phoenix, especially when you're being arrested under these manifestation laws and prostitution laws, the law is so broad that they can just get you. And if you have a judge that is not smart and conscious of how these laws impact people, which none of them are, you're going to get convicted. And especially in Arizona, especially in Phoenix, where you don't have a right to a jury trial for a misdemeanor. And so all that is taken away from you. And so in my case, I had a judge who decided that I was guilty, right? It wasn't a jury of my peers. And when we talk about jury of peers, is that really what it looks like for trans people, right? And so we look at this system as a moneymaker, right? And we look at the criminal justice system as a moneymaker. It's just like this whole, when we really want to think about you think about it as the slave industrial complex, right? Where the ankle monitors, right? That's a part of the prison industrial system, right? You still have to pay for that. That makes money for the prisons, right? When you have to pay for your parole officer to visit your parole officer and you don't have the money to pay, you're going back to prison, right? And so it's all about making money, right? But when we take that power away and say, you know what, you can't arrest trans people for just walking down the street. No, you cannot arrest people for selling loose cigarettes. No, you cannot arrest people for having drug criminality failures on them. And so when we end the ways that people get interactions with the police and get our interactions with the criminal justice system, then we can truly talk about defunding the police, right? Because if we want to have these conversations about defunding the police, we must really do our work and tackle these laws and ordinances that pit people in direct contact with the police. I hope I answered your question.
Yes, and beautifully. And you brought up some stuff that I hope we can get into a little bit later, because, bringing up defunding the police, which is really important and also trending now. Like you added this extra layer of like, we can't just defund the police. We also have to dismantle these racist, transphobic, homophobic, classist, etc. laws that are putting our folks in jail and prisons and really hindering their lives. So yes, you absolutely answered. Yeah, thank you. So let me turn to Beth, Dr. Beth Richie. So Beth, in your books, articles, videos, and other places, you discuss how prison is gender violence. And I think Vicky mentioned the video that you just did with Monica Cosby and Rachel Kydor for ILCHEP and Love and Protect, which is out there and still available. So, I mean, I also can say that we can see how the entire legal system sanctions gender violence in different ways. But can you talk a little bit about how prison reform and alternatives, as well as police reform, can sometimes show up as gender violence?
I always forget the unmute part. Hey, everyone. Yeah, that's really a good question. I really appreciate having a chance to talk about it for a couple different reasons. Before I do, though, I want to say what an amazing panel this is and what an amazing book this is. I waited a long time for it. I think Prison by Any Other Name is exactly like the right thing for us to be talking about right now. So thank you, Maya and Vicky, for your work. And thanks to Women and Children First, indeed, one of the best places in the world to be. So I'm glad to have a chance to talk about this, Deana, in part because at this particular moment, where so many people are talking about abolition, I think it's really important that we not let gender violence be the reason that we can't embrace an abolition politic. By that, I mean, it's often like the last excuse why we have to have policing, we have to have prisons, we have to advocate for arrest. Why? Because there are some people who use gender violence and we have to keep, usually the argument is we have to keep women safe. So I'm really thrilled that we're having a discussion about gender violence at the same time we're talking about abolition. So there are many of us activists against gender violence and people who've been struggling against the carceral state who draw a pretty direct connection between those two things. And while I think it's important to be careful about oversimplifying analogies, they're not exactly the same thing. It is important to notice the connection between the root causes of the harm. heteropatriarchy, white supremacy, misogyny, things that people have already talked about, racial capitalism, investment in prisons and policing. Those things appear both in violence toward women, trans people, genderqueer community members, and they appear in carceral spaces like jails, prisons, secure psychiatric facilities, and the like. So at the most basic level, there's a dynamic of power and control that are present in both spaces. Bodies are regulated, fear is created, often with a threat of physical injury, exposure to sexual manipulation and sexual violence, physical isolation. Often people who experience gender violence are isolated, just like people who are in carceral facilities are isolated. An emotional control, and then a kind of long-term social disenfranchisement. All of this based on a kind of arbitrary authority that's used to dominate and control people with less social power. Now, what's important about this is all of it's done with impunity. That is, it's naturalized. These are spaces where harm and violence is expected, not necessarily considered wrong. It's legitimate because structures of power authorize certain groups of people to use violence to control other groups of people. So with regard to gender violence, we've learned from survivors that abuse takes many forms. It happens in many contexts. It's physical, it's sexual, and rather than being an isolated set of incidents, it's a pattern. It's a pattern of coercion that fundamentally shapes relationships. That's both gender violence and its carceral spaces, where the person who has the most power uses arbitrary authority to dominate, manipulate, and control other people. Fear, regulation, all of that becomes part of how it works. The same thing is true for people who are under state control. They attested this similar set of circumstances. Even in those places that aren't a prison, that aren't in a building, you see dehumanized conditions where people have to account for or get permission for or are controlled in terms of their behavior. There's a kind of sense of being outside of your body. You're rendered non-human or not as human as the person who's controlling you, be that someone in a correctional setting, a parole officer, a counselor in a forced treatment facility, or an abusive partner. And the threat or actual violence is a constant dynamic that people are trying to avoid. So people in carceral spaces and who are experiencing gender violence are afraid. They're left poor, they're disoriented, emotionally distressed. There's a way that your body and your mind and your spirit are all murdered. You're isolated from the opportunities for support, either self-advocacy or advocacy from other groups. And in both places, this is really important, in both spaces, abusive relationships and carceral spaces, people are blamed for getting themselves into that situation and not being able to get themselves out of it. That is, we shift the gaze of why people are harmed or in harm's way. We shift the gaze away from the state and state policy onto the people themselves. So I think it's really important as we think about reform to make sure that we're not engaging in the kind of reform that replicates those dynamics, calling it some other name, but not replicating those dynamics, and in fact doing something different. And I have some ideas about the things that we could do different that I'll talk about later. Thanks.
Thank you, Beth. And Maya, I want to kind of go back to you because you mentioned that you wanted to say something a little bit more about the child welfare resistance, because it gets often left out. So if you want to jump in here.
Oh yeah, no, I just meant later on.
Oh.
Like when we talk about solutions. Yeah.
I'm with you. All right.
Cool.
So And that's kind of a sneak peek into, we're not just going to be like, this is, it's horrible, it's horrible, it's horrible. We're going to talk about solutions, but also the ways that we are already and have been working towards a world that keeps our communities safe, that keeps ourselves safe without state-sanctioned violence, without state-sanctioned ideologies and restrictions. So now I have really two more questions for the entire group. And the first question, and I'm going to start with I'm going to start with Vicky. So Vicky and everybody else, I want everyone else to think about this. So in addition to Alternatives to Prison, you know, your book, Prison by Any Other Name, I just want to keep pubbing it for folks. Here we go. Discusses how the prison nation, as Dr. Beth Richie puts it, extends into other aspects of our lives. So in our discussion today, all of you have mentioned how prisons, the carceral system, invades people's lives. And I thought about this analogy, and it might be a little bit off-putting for folks, but the carceral system should be off-putting for folks. So it's almost like a deer tick that kind of embeds itself into people and does long-lasting damage that just pops up randomly. You know, it's a systemic damage. And I'm going to stop the analogy there, but because I don't want to gross people out. So it's doing this type of damage. And some of the examples that I've heard from you are the foster care system, sex offense registries. I've talked about school policing very briefly. Some forms of mental health treatment are all examples of the damage that can be done. So I would like you to really, and you've done some of this already, but just to kind of underscore it, can you each explicitly connect how gender really shows up in some of these extensions of prison?
Well, everything that Dr. Richie just outlined in terms of the ways in which prisons and abusive relationships mirror each other and the dynamic replicates in each other carries out in all of these examples of popular alternatives to incarceration. So I want to be clear that we're not talking about grassroots solutions that are community driven. We're talking about the state says, you know, we have too many people with mental health problems in our prison system. The solution is lock down psychiatric treatment. The solution is lock them someplace else. But so looking at the ways in which involuntary mental health confinement and treatment. So this is not, I am feeling like I need help and I am taking myself to the doctor or to the clinic or to the hospital or whatever, you know, place is available to give me help. It is somebody saying like, I am going to take you there involuntarily, or you go there and you say, I need help, and you are locked up instead of getting help. The ways in which what we've seen is involuntary mental health confinement often doesn't address underlying trauma. Instead, it punishes people for either seeking help or being seen as in need of some sort of mental health help. It often, it places people in a sense of confinement. And then for people who have histories of abuse and trauma, which many women, people who identify as women, cis women and trans women, who end up in the prison system or end up criminalized or end up in any of these or in many of these alternatives to incarceration, often talk about having past histories of abuse and trauma, and being stuck in involuntary mental health confinement simply re-traumatizes them. So they're being re-traumatized physically, mentally, emotionally, while their concerns are also not being taken seriously, which is what happens to people who are often traumatized and abused, particularly women. And the quote unquote help that is offered is often not ways that address these underlying traumas, and instead put the onus on the individual person to somehow get through it. Here are some coping mechanisms. When you feel angry, tear the pages out of this book. and or color within the lines or outside of the lines or however you color, but it doesn't actually say, allow people to say, maybe the reason why I'm having these fill in the blank, is because there was this childhood trauma that happened to me, or this continual trauma that has been happening to me through childhood, through young adulthood, through, my current stage in life, however old I am. And many of these groups actually, or many of these lockdown involuntary confinement facilities do these group therapies that don't allow people to talk about these traumas. For adolescents, it's often seen as telling war stories. And somehow there's the idea that if you talk about the trauma that you've endured, you're somehow bragging or, like showing off, as opposed to sharing. And then in the adult facilities, there's that same discouragement and downplaying and dismissing of trauma, particularly women's trauma, when they talk about what happened to them previously that, was a pathway to them ending up in this facility that is an underlying cause for any mental health issues or challenges that they might have. And instead, what happens is that they're medicated, which we've seen throughout history, is that women who are seen as defiant or unruly or unable to conform to the gender norms of the time are often punished. They're often medicated. They're often confined until they conform to whatever it is that they're expected to do, or somehow learn to play by society's rules. So we see the ways in which these same gender dynamics that Dr. Richie talks about play out in mental health confinement. We see this also in drug treatment and all sorts of other lockdown facilities where people are confined, often at risk of or are physically and sexually abused. And they often are there. So it's just trauma upon trauma compounding upon them. And then they're told, shame on you, you did not somehow get yourself better.
Thank you. Maya, you want to jump in?
Yeah. I think that was absolutely right, Vicki. And these extensions of the prison nation, as Beth calls it, really, they seep into all of these different aspects of life. So the institutions that we take to be non-carceral, like schools, and into our families and our home spaces. And so I want to talk briefly about the foster care system and family regulation on that note. And I think that this is like inherently gendered because the so-called child welfare system, or really the family regulation system, is an arena in which women, and particularly Black and Indigenous women, are overwhelmingly targeted. Most of the primary caregivers in the system's clutches are women. And so there's a reality that we have to face in thinking about this system. And this is that usually when parents and caregivers are investigated by Child Protective Services, the allegation is neglect. And most allegations of neglect are related to poverty. Children not having adequate shelter or food or clothing or healthcare. And so this reminds us, first of all, again, that these systems are products of racial capitalism. Mothers living in poverty are targeted. Black and Indigenous mothers are targeted. And this has been documented really extensively by Dorothy Roberts, Charity Tolliver, the Movement for Family Power, and others. And so it all comes back to blaming mothers, blaming certain mothers. The idea is that if a child is not getting enough, it must be a particular parent, usually a mother, who's not making the cut, not making enough effort. And one of the people whose stories we shared in our book had her children taken away from her because she called a social service agency for help. The DHS, so-called Child Protective Services, showed up at her door after she called a domestic violence hotline to seek help fleeing an abusive relationship. And the caseworkers took her 4 children and told her that she wouldn't get her kids back until she, quote unquote, got safe. And they gave her no resources to do so. So she grabbed her backpack, she left home, but she had no housing. She ended up sleeping on buses. And DHS told her that her poverty, her lack of income, and insecure housing were additional reasons that she could not be reunited with her kids, on top of being a survivor of domestic violence. And one more thing to note about that, I think, is she was also chronically ill at the time. And DHS said that her health problems were yet another reason she couldn't get her kids back. So we see how ableism is interlaced with the violence of patriarchy and the violence of racial capitalism and the violence of these punishment systems. So instead of providing this mother with basic survival resources for herself and her family, this system required her to, one of the things is to take parenting classes. Again, this is framed as a service, but it's actually making what they're calling neglect an issue of personal responsibility, completely absolving society for failing this person. This woman ended up living at a homeless shelter and still only seeing her kids at weekly supervised visits. So she was punished for being a survivor, for her poverty, for her disability and illness, punished for needing some kind of support. And as any of us who are mothers or caregivers know, all of us need some kind of support. It's just that some people have family or friends who are able to provide it, and some of us are able to pay for it. And if you don't have those things, there should be a safety net. And instead, there's this blaming of individual mothers and individual survivors. And there's the net of the criminal punishment system, which is masquerading as protecting children.
Thanks, Maya. Monica, do you want to respond?
Yeah, so I want to wrap tell this quick summary. So when we talk about DCS and Child Protective Service, as a social worker, myself as a social worker, we have to understand, I'm going to tell you this quick little story. When I was arrested, I got out and my cousin went to jail for a program that they had placed in Phoenix, Arizona, where if you were in a relationship with someone who was selling drugs and you guys lived together, you were arrested under the same charges. And at this time, she had 3 kids. She had 4 kids, and her youngest daughter was under 1 year old. And as a result, she called me and I was in school, and she said, "Can you go get my kids? Their CPS is at the house, and I'm trying to run there." And they saw who I was, and they said, "No, you cannot get the kids." And so what ended up happening was they saw my transcripts. I was going to court. They saw who I was. They saw my transcripts. And my cousin's reaction was like, "You are someone I know. You are someone that I trust." And her instincts as who trans people were to her and to our communities before colonialization and before white Christianity came in triggered her to say, "You are my cousin, get my kids." So she knew my role as someone to take care of kids when their parent was away. And so, but DCS and this whole system really blocked me for doing my work and doing what I'm here for, right? And so we ended up losing 1 child to DCS, and that's a lost child that we have, right? But we also have this connection to DCS and the prison industrial complex, right? Where mothers are the ones who are directly blamed for any fault in the house, right? And so these are ongoing things, but especially in Black communities, right, where Black women are having their children ripped away from them, which are triggering traumas, right? To traumas that are upon us and that are in our DNA from slavery, right? So my cousin doesn't know why she is drinking nightly, because substance abuse is the direct correlation to trauma, right? And that's how people deal with it. Then if she gets arrested for substance abuse, right, she ends up with her kids again, right? Because they have not dealt with the trauma, right? And DCS does not see the person as a whole person, especially the prison industrial complex, right? And so that's how, when we talk about alternatives, when we talk about what's the alternative, it's dealing with the trauma, right? Because we have to have this long battle in this country. Just acknowledge the trauma that individuals are going through and stop policing that trauma, right? Because they're so quickly tell us to get over it. And when we can't get over it, our next instinct is to engage in substance abuse, right? And it's so cheap to get, right? And that's why so many trans individuals are in prison due to substance abuse, because of trauma that is placed on their bodies.
Thank you for that. That's powerful.
Yeah.
Beth, I want to go to you and also hear what you want to add to this amazing conversation.
Yeah, well, I'm really moved, Monica, by that story and how there's a way that gender just gets played, and Black women just get played in this, right? Black trans people get played in this. So in some ways, it's a story. I mean, the book is a story, and our experience is a story of kind of how neoliberal social services get aligned with a kind of racial capitalism that plays gender, like plays it out in a bad way. So I think about a couple of things. One is that a lot of the policing of trauma, that term is so powerful that you use, Monica. So a lot of the policing of trauma is done by women in kind of traditional women's roles: social workers, teachers, counselors, therapists, etc. So we have to notice that. Second, that work is done based on a sort of assumption, or at least a rhetoric of care. And I think we need to be particularly noticing this now as we're in this moment of thinking about what abolition can look like. And do we substitute social workers who are going to care with police officers who are going to use violence, but then the social workers are in fact going to still feed the same carceral system? So we have to be, I think, worried about the notion of care. Third, a lot of the spreading of the carceral approaches outside of jails and prisons into community social service spaces, if you will, is done under the guise of protecting vulnerable people, like children. And then, I guess lastly, and most importantly, unless we look at the root causes of both gender violence and state violence through the carceral state, it's just going to spread to whatever place is available until we look at the root causes. And I think that's sometimes harder to do than to respond to the crisis. And so, I just want to maybe answer what I think might be your next question already, Deana, if I can do that. And for me, it's about how we need to be careful about reform and do something else instead. And here's where I'm just going to bring in a little bit of abolition feminism. Probably it's not going to surprise anybody. I think that feminist organizing can help us interrupt the
prison by any other name phenomena that we see, where everything becomes a place for people to get caught up in the criminal legal system. First, I think we need to not focus only on the crisis and look at long-term issues. So the crisis means we arrest someone in the case of gender violence instead of looking at long-term safety, or the crisis is we'll close a women's jail but agree to electronic monitoring. Second is, and this is kind of related, I think sometimes in political organizing, we cut deals, for lack of a better way of saying it. We cut deals to get some short-term results. So we pass legislation that protects women, but doesn't include trans people, thinking like, oh, we'll get to that when we can. Or I think, as Vicki was talking about, we focus on releasing non-violent offenders, so-called non-violent offenders, and then we'll like come back for the rest some other time. And I think that's because we forget to listen to those people who are most impacted, and we instead defer to kind of a level of social worker, advocate. These are the rescue people, I think, that Monica was kind of talking about, people who kind of take this up as a cause, as opposed to people who have a lived experience of either gender violence or the criminal legal system. And again, I think that means that the people who are doing the enforcing are different people, but the impact is the same. And you might get a little bit less of this, but you get more of that. So I think in the case of gender violence, if you say you have to stop using physical violence, the emotional abuse skyrockets and people feel as at risk as they do sometimes when there's physical violence. Or you might say we've got to close down the prisons, but we don't look at the root causes of investment in carcerality. So we start policing people through child protective, so-called protective services, or schools, or hospitals, or health clinics, reproductive justice organizations, et cetera. So I think part of it is we have to really look at the root causes, and we have to be willing to do a much more radical kind of organizing, not just kind of go for the easy wins. People call it the low-hanging fruit. No, we can't do that. Or only involve ourselves in responding to immediate crisis and not, take the long-term view.
Yeah, thanks so much, Beth. And what everyone's bringing up, but specifically, you and Monica really brought up for me, is that defunding police, while super important and necessary, does not mean we fund other institutions that have created trauma for Black, Indigenous, people of color, of any gender. So social workers are great when they are actually working for our folks, and not creating more trauma. So thank you all for that. So I have, at the late hour, I added another question, and we're going to wrap up this part of the program and go into a Q&A with some of the audience questions. And the question that I wanted to ask, that I will and am asking folks on the panel, is what is an example, and Beth, you talked about this, but what is an example of a feminist abolitionist intervention / project that gives you hope today? So I'm gonna let you think about that, and hopefully this is good pedagogy. While you think of an answer, and audience, also please feel free to add your examples in the chat at YouTube or Zoom. So while the speakers think about this, I want to say a couple things, to kind of bide some time and wrap this part up. So again, I want to share another brief quote from Mariame Kaba. Hope is a discipline. And I'll say it again, but it's also, on my earrings. I don't know if you can see it that well. These are made by my love and protect homie, Sangi Ravichandran, Salty Brown Femme Crafts on Instagram. Hope is a discipline. And the way I interpret that is that as a discipline, we must continue to practice. I mean, most people are not naturally hopeful, especially in a time of multiple pandemics or syndemics, I believe. But if you remember what I said at the beginning, I want us to challenge ourselves to turn towards hope and away from despair. And like we practice any skill, whether it's meditation, knitting, yoga, some sort of sports balling type thing, we need to practice the ideologies we hold onto that guide our lives, such as hope. So we must practice hope. And I'm going to say it's difficult and challenging, and we will falter at times, and it will probably be uncomfortable at times because we are doing the work to change, but we will get stronger in our practice of hope, right? Change, or that uncomfortable feeling, is where change happens, and we start to grow in other ways. So I'm going to ask again, and Vicky, I'm going to ask you first, what is an example of feminist abolitionist, or an example of feminist abolitionist intervention / project that gives you hope today?
So I'm going to go a little bit out of the box of, feminist abolitionist project interventions and projects. Perhaps not currently operating today because we're in a pandemic, in which it is very hard to operate. But when my daughter, who is now a grown person, was younger, there were childcare collectives that had sprung up to take care of kids in movement spaces and at movement events and for meetings. And this was a way to give folks who are organizing and parenting, but particularly mothers, because we know how society genders parenting, a chance to participate in the in political organizing and not just be shunted to the side, and it didn't be or have the onus of finding childcare shunted onto them. And it also gave children an opportunity to be around other people, whether it was to participate in some of the political stuff that was happening, or just whatever, go out for ice cream and go watch Harry Potter with somebody that wasn't a parent. So that gives me hope. When we first started doing media for our book, we actually were interviewed by somebody who had been in college in Champaign-Urbana, who told us about this program that neither Maya nor I knew about, called a crisis nursery, where it was 24-hour drop-in daycare. If you were having a crisis, if you needed to go to the hospital, if you might get arrested, if somebody else was having an emergency, if you just were going to lose your mind, you could go drop your kid off, and it was safe and secure emergency childcare. So now think about what that would look like for parents, for families, especially for all the female parents that often get stuck with the thankless job of childcare, and child rearing, and are often told, if you can't handle it, we're going to send child welfare after you. Very few people tell this to a father whose children are, having a tantrum or have cookie crumbs all over their face or whatever. So imagine what that would look like towards abolition, and the abolition of these prison-light types of institutions that corral so many parents. If we had things like childcare collectives and crisis nurseries, and just this cultural shift in how we view supporting families and parents. Think about what that kind of society would look like, and then how much less power there would be in some of these other institutions that punish and imprison parents.
Thank you. Maya, what's up?
Yeah, no, I was just thinking, listening to Vicky, I think that's really powerful. We've had some good conversations around this since our book came out, where I feel like so often child welfare gets left out of the conversation around imprisonment. And actually, I think, Beth, reading your definition of prison nation, I can't remember which time you defined it, or you said this specifically, that like, unlike a lot of definitions of the prison industrial complex, you included that in one of the tentacles of the prison nation. And I think that when we consider abolition feminism, that's such a essential thing we need to consider, because it interlaces with so many other pieces, particularly this piece about social workers, right? Because social workers are already doing policing within the system of child protective services. And on that note, I wanted to point to the work of the Movement for Family Power, which is doing all kinds of really important things around advocating for a drastic and dramatic and powerful shift in this realm of the foster system. They produced the Ground Zero report, which focused on the racist impact of the foster system just recently. They have a campaign demanding that medical providers get informed consent from pregnant people and mothers before they're drug tested. And they're also raising awareness during COVID about some of the repressive ways that the foster system is responding during the pandemic, and just taking away visits and all kinds of other things. And there are a number of other groups that have focused on this type of work over the years and just have not gotten attention. DHS, Give Us Back Our Children in Philadelphia, Welfare Warriors in Milwaukee, Black on Both Sides in Chicago, the National Coalition for Child Protection Reform. And many of these groups are organizing toward what a real child welfare system would look like. So Welfare Warriors, for example, lifts up a demand for a guaranteed child support program that would provide resources for kids until they're 18. And they also advocate for payment for what they call mother work, which includes parenting one's own children. So think about how, we take for granted that so many types of caregiving have no compensation whatsoever, even when people are losing compensation that they might otherwise have by doing that caregiving. And I think these kinds of demands are about addressing systemic injustice, which gets masked by the scapegoating of individual mothers and caregivers, which is misogynist and racist and ableist in the way it plays out. And I also, one more thing that popped into my head in terms of abolitionist feminist paths forward when it comes to child welfare, is that I think we need to keep creating systems that are outside of state punishment and control when it comes to making it possible for children to come forward about actual abuse. Most child welfare reports are about neglect, and those largely relate to poverty. But we also want to fully recognize that child abuse is a reality. And a lot of research has shown that children are actually less likely to seek help when they know that doing so will lead to a mandated report to Child Protective Services and getting that whole punishment system involved. And so I think we need to be looking to groups like the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective, which focuses on addressing child sexual abuse outside of the criminal legal system in ways that address the abuse that's happening, the interpersonal abuse, and also prevents future violence against children. And
Yeah, we need to be thinking about what it would mean also, I think, to be providing actual counseling and social service support that is not connected with systems of punishment.
Thank you. Monica, I know you have to get off soon. I want to ask the question, or have you answer the same question, but also you dropped something in the chat. Can I send it to all attendees?
Yep, that's what I want to talk about.
All right, go for it.
So a great program that I'm proud of and hopeful for is this mutual aid work that is surrounding COVID when it comes to sex workers, especially trans women of color, sex workers who engage in sex work during COVID. And so what a lot of organizations are doing is coming up with this mutual aid support. So giving them finance support during this time of COVID, right? That so many other individuals can apply for unemployment, but we know trans women who engage in sex work may not have that option to apply for unemployment. And so the mutual aid work that my organization and many other organizations is trying to fill that void for trans women and women of color who engage in sex work, to provide them money to survive, right? And so this money can be used for buying groceries, buying household goods, anything that person feels fit, because we're not going to police what they're going to use the money for, but we're going to say, if you need this money, here it is. And so what my organization is doing, that we found out that a lot of people just need money just for general costs, right? Cover a hotel stay, to get groceries, to get a hotel room. And so I've really amazed by this work that and other organizations that are doing, because that is truly transformative when it comes down, when you ask people what they need, it mostly comes down to monetary things, right? And so when you can't give, I cannot pray for a trans woman and so I hope they feel better. What we need to do is give action and say, here's $500. Do what you got to do with this money and be the best person you can be with this money.
Thank you. Sure, people want to give up prayers, but money actually is a lot more helpful. Yes. Anyway, you could do both. Just do both. How about that? Beth, so we are literally out of time, but I want to, make sure, Beth, you got some time.
Well, I mean, I'm next time I'm going to say I don't want to go after Monica. Okay, so let's start there.
Sorry.
I don't have a lot more to add. I feel like, actually, Deana, love and protect is one that I hold up as, there's something about helping people survive and then welcoming them home that just is like the right, and then doing political work around the issue is, to me, such a perfect example of abolition feminism. And I do want to give credit to you and your work and the work of, the other people involved. I don't have other examples to lift up. You've named amazing organizations, and it is really very inspiring. Like halfway through this, I was like, okay, this is so depressing. Like, why are we doing this tonight? But when you end with these amazing examples, there is a, abolition feminist future, I guess. So nothing more to add than that.
Great, thank you. Thank you, everybody. I know we are over time. I said, of course, that we would have a Q&A, and just so much amazing stuff. There were a few questions that we can try to address offline. I'm not sure that we have the expertise to really address these questions, but I will try to get back to you. I do also want to lift up the work that, so Love and Protect, some of the sponsors, Chicago Community Bond Fund, that they're doing, Chicago Books to Women in Prison, Moms United Against Violence and Incarceration. So all of Love and Protect's comrades, all of our comrades, people that we work with. I would also like to just shout out Survived and Punished, and California Coalition of Women Prisoners, all and many of others who are doing really good work to not only support people who are incarcerated, but really like trying to get them out and not only defunding the prison industrial complex, but really trying to abolish it, while also we didn't get into deeply into the specifics, but just as a reminder that abolition is not just about dismantling, but it's also about creating communities where people are safe and our communities are safe, and that we are building places that in a world that we want to live in, and not just, although it is important, abolishing prisons and police. So I want to end on this message of hope that we are winning, we are succeeding, and there are so many amazing people out there fighting and doing this work. And want to just say, Maya, Vicky, anybody else want to jump in before we log off?
I just want to thank people for coming. And I think, right, there's so much weighty stuff. There's so much weighty stuff here. And I think even more when you go beyond prison and you think about how the system infiltrates every aspect of our lives, it can be overwhelming. But there are so many organizations doing awesome work, and maybe there are ways that we can also like get some of these links out and share more resources with people who signed up. You know, I think there are ways we can do that, just because it's not just, I think in our book, Ruth Wilson Gilmore said, abolition is not an aspirational adventure. It's happening right now. And people are on top of it. So, you know, a lot of work left to do, but it's happening.
People are on top of it, and we need more people.
Yes. Yes, always.
All right. Well, thank you all so much. Please stay tuned to other events, read this amazing book. And I guess we'll see you in